No, 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 no. We don't want to do that. I'm going to have to put Julia. You okay? Say goodbye. So it struck me over this last weekend as I was watching Bill Maher on television comment about all of the things that are going on, and in particular, he had a nutritionist on his show, and he was badgering the nutritionist as to why the medical community has not educated everybody, because the people who are becoming the most ill from COVID-19 have been people that are old on the one hand, and then also with so-called comorbidities. And the comorbidities, the diseases that the people have that have gotten them into trouble, and most of the deaths have been in this category, are number one, obesity. Secondly, diabetes mellitus. Then cardiac heart problems, and then lung problems. And of course, the COVID-19 virus, and I've gone through this before in some of the coronavirus videos, the virus binds to a receptor that's really widely distributed throughout the body because, number one, it's on all the blood vessels, on the interior lining of the blood vessels. And when the virus binds to the receptor, it goes inside the cells and sets up shop, and the only thing the virus wants to do is replicate itself, and so it starts replicating. And the same receptors are also on heart cells and on lung cells and on kidney cells and on intestinal cells. And those are the major organs of the body that run into problems with the virus infection. And as I've said before, it's not the virus per se that's the problem. It's really all of the signs and symptoms of the infection are caused by the immune reaction to the presence of the virus on those cells. And so what happens when the immune system starts to become involved is that it secretes all kinds of molecules, cytokines and so forth that cause what we know now as the cardinal signs of inflammation, meaning that it's red, hot, swollen, and sore. And of course, because the receptors are all over the body, the whole body becomes red, hot, swollen, and sore. And ultimately, if that progresses, that can be a major problem. And so it's really, to my mind, it's not known why the comorbidities of obesity and heart and lung disease and so forth leave you particularly susceptible to the inflammatory response. But be that as it may, as I've stressed before, the way this virus operates is that it blocks the initial innate immune response for about 10 to 14 days so that the virus replicates unimpeded, and then subsequently the acquired immune response kicks in, and then there's a huge battle, and the huge battle results in a huge amount of inflammation, and it's the inflammatory response that causes all the problems. So what as an individual, what can you do about this in this day and age of COVID-19? How can you help yourself and protect yourself? And the answers are not necessarily, there's nothing you can do acutely, but chronically over a long term, you can avoid all those comorbidities, particularly the obesity and also the heart disease, and in particular, it's the obesity and the diabetes that have been a major problem in the United States in the past 50 years. The thing is that you don't really get into difficulties with these kinds of things, with obesity and diabetes and so forth, except for the fact that in our modern society, we are under a lot of stress. And as a consequence, stress at our job, stress at home, stress with the family, ways people then go to sort of combat that stress is that they get into what people have found are various ways to deal with this stress. And almost all of them result in an addiction of one form or another. And the most common addictions in our modern society are to nicotine, to smoking, alcohol, drugs, and food. And food has been the major problem in the last 40, 50 years. And it's clear now from studies that have been done by a lot of investigators that food can become addicting. And if you just look around the society and see people that are just morbidly obese, is what the phrase that's used, you wonder how they get that way. Well, the answer is that they're addicted, and they're addicted to food, and the food that they're addicted to is sugar. And the sugar molecule, there's different kinds that people are addicted to, is fructose. It comes from fruits, and that's why it's called fructose. Fructose is sweet. Table sugar is a molecule that contains fructose and another sugar molecule called glucose, and they're bonded together through a chemical bond. But it's the fructose that tastes good and is sweet. And the thing about this is that there are three major macronutrients that people are exposed, that people use to burn fuel to live. One of them is carbohydrates. Second one is fat. Third is protein. The carbohydrates are comprised of sugar and starch. That's it. And what starch is just a big polymer of sugar molecules. And actually, if you think about it, starch itself, which starch is, where is starch? Starch is in pasta, potatoes, bread, and those foodstuffs are not sweet. They basically don't have a whole lot of taste at all. It's when we put other things on them, particularly fats and proteins, that then they start to taste really good. And so starch, in many respects, becomes a carrier to get other molecules into our mouths and so forth. And so it's a combination of the sugar and the sweetness and the starch that's used as a carrier of fat and protein that ultimately does us in, really. And the reason for that is that if you think about the history of man, the discovery of agriculture around 5,000 to 10,000 years ago, depending on what part of the world you're talking about. But most of the Western civilization came from the so-called Levant, which is the Tigris and Euphrates, and then swinging around to Egypt and the Nile River Valley, because they had enough water and sun to grow wheat. And so for basically all of human history, this major source of carbohydrates was bread. And that was fine. That's one of the reasons that the Roman army wanted to conquer Egypt and so forth, because they needed bread to feed their populace over there in Italy, because all they had were olive trees and vineyards. And they needed the starch. So it wasn't until the discovery of the New World, which is now only like 500 years ago, that we came up with corn from Mexico and potatoes from Peru. The introduction of corn and potatoes into the European diet was the real thing that allowed the populations to expand in Europe, particularly in Northern Europe, and particularly the potato became very important because it grew below the ground in the inclement weather in Northern Europe as compared to the Mediterranean weather. You couldn't grow wheat up in Germany and Scandinavia and England and Scotland, but you could grow potatoes. And so potatoes became the major staple and the major thing that allowed population growth. But that's 500 years or even 5,000 years in biological evolutionary terms is not very long. Prior to that, the millions of years, the 20 million years or so that they think that the primate evolved into the hominid, and so we had our first ancestors of modern humans, they really subsisted on a diet that was almost all protein, a little bit of fat, and almost zero carbohydrates, because they couldn't grow wheat. They were hunter-gatherers, essentially. And what that means is that they were hard scrabble, and they were mostly starving all the time. And the body evolved to really hold on to anything that was introduced into it. If it didn't burn it up right away, it held on to it. And so with the introduction of carbohydrates in terms of the bread and then corn and then potatoes, suddenly there was enough foodstuffs, macronutrients, for the human population to proliferate. which was all very, very good. As a consequence of that whole history, though, is that it's only been 500 years or 5,000 years is a drop in the bucket in terms of the evolution of our cells and their ability to handle different kinds of foodstuffs. And certainly, we haven't had enough time to adapt to a high carbohydrate diet. And that's the problem of today, because carbohydrates are ubiquitously present in our diet and around us. And in particular, fast foods would not exist without carbohydrates. It's only been within the last 50 years that we've come into an epidemic of obesity since the 1970s. And one of the major reasons, at least in our country, in the United States, is that scientists, in particular, a couple of Japanese scientists in the early 1970s, figured out how to make an industrial approach to taking the starch primarily from corn and breaking down the large polymer molecules into individual glucose molecules. Remember, glucose is not sweet. And a polymer of glucose isn't sweet either. So that's bread and pasta and so forth. They figured out how to break it down into the tiny monomer molecules. That wasn't sweet either. And then they used an enzyme, an industrial scale approach to convert the glucose to fructose. Aha. That's the key thing. That's the key thing, because then they could take cornstarch. You might have a little box of cornstarch in your kitchen. If you dip your finger in it and taste it, it doesn't have any taste, or it's not sweet. It doesn't have any taste either. It's not sweet. They created a situation whereby you break down all the glucose molecules and have them individual, and then convert half of them to fructose, and then you just mix them together. And what you get then is high fructose corn syrup. And nowadays, in the 21st century, it's in everything. Because that leads to the other situation with regard to our diets, and it gets to be political. The U.S. Department of Agriculture essentially has been taken over by big agribusiness. And they have convinced Congress to put tariffs on sugar, cane sugar, and beet sugar coming in from the equatorial areas of the world and also from other areas, so that they've artificially elevated the price of table sugar. Meanwhile, they have our government has subsidized the corn farmers, big agribusiness again. They're not, Farmer McDonald out there anymore. They are workers in the fields that are minimum wage employees of these big agribusiness places. And they have subsidized the big agribusiness, and they do that via the farm bill that gets refunded every 5 years. And there's a huge amount of subsidy going on for the big agribusiness, so that they have reduced the real cost of the high fructose corn syrup, so that it's competitive with the cane sugar, the table sugar. To give you an idea about that, Coca-Cola in the United States has converted all of its sweetener in the real classic Coca-Cola recipe to high fructose corn syrup. If they used cane sugar in the United States for Coca-Cola, which was the original recipe, it would cost them $100 billion more to use cane sugar than it does to use high fructose corn syrup. So that's where we are. And the thing is that it's in the infant formulas. Kids grow up in our country today addicted to fructose. If it's not sweet, they won't eat it. My own grandson informed me. He said, so I explained all this to him, and he said to me, so if it tastes good, I shouldn't eat it. Is that correct? And I said, yes, that is correct. So we're dealing with a situation where 2/3 of the country, of adults in our country nowadays, are either overweight or obese, 67%. And not recently, but a little while ago, I attended my 50th high school reunion. And so I hadn't been back to my high school for many years, and so I got out the yearbook And I was struck by the fact that of all the people in my class, there was nobody that was overweight. There was nobody overweight, and for sure nobody that was obese, morbidly obese. But nowadays, around 20% of the people in high school are essentially overweight or obese. 2/3 of once you become an adult. Because the other thing that happens when you become an adult and you can become more sedentary and so forth, and you're working all the time, you gain an average person in our country gains about 10 pounds, about a pound a year, 1 pound a year, which is not, you don't really even notice it. But after 10 years, you're 10 pounds overweight. So when you're 30, you weigh 10 pounds more than you did when you were 20. And when you're 40, you're 20 pounds over your playing weight. And by the time you're 50, you're 30 pounds over your playing weight. And now it's harder to play because you're 30 pounds overweight. So the question is, so what to do about all this business? And I think the one other thing I should have said is that there's also concomitantly or simultaneously with the obesity epidemic is that there is a diabetes epidemic, secondary diabetes, or so-called adult onset diabetes. It's all due to the fact that there's just too much sugar and starch in our diet, and we've just overloaded the system. The system that evolved to deal with protein and a little bit of fat, and now we're throwing huge amounts of carbohydrates out. I should say one thing more before I get into the what to do about this, and that is of the three major nutrients: carbohydrates, fat, and protein. Carbohydrates, if the body was to just store the sugar and starch in the molecular form that we take it in, it would take up too much room, because the first thing that happens when we ingest the starch or the sugar is that for every glucose molecule or fructose molecule, 6 water molecules attached to it. That's why it's called carbohydrate. And the hydration of that makes everything huge. And so that the body, you'd have to store nutrients in the body as a carbohydrate. You'd have to have a 6 times bigger body than you do now. And so the body's figured this out. And what it does is that no matter how you take it in, if you take in too many nutrients, the body converts those nutrients to fat, because fat doesn't have any water associated with it. And so you can cram in a huge amount of energy in the form of fat that would take much bigger volume to be able to store carbohydrates. And so whatever we take in, it gets converted to fat first. And then ultimately the body will figure out how to distribute that fat and then use that fat if it needs it for energy and so forth. I was first made aware of this whole story back about 15, 20 years ago, when my wife and I moved to New York City from a small town in New Hampshire. And immediately, this is just a little bit of personal storytelling here. So we moved from a situation whereby we were basically up in New Hampshire, we were workaholics, and we'd been that way for 20 years. And our weights were very, very stable, and there was no problem. And then we moved to New York City, and suddenly my wife was not working nights and weekends anymore because she owned a restaurant up there. She had a different job where she basically worked just days and only weekdays. And so in the great big city, we started going out to dinner, here and there and yon. And the first thing they do is they bring you the bread basket. We never ate bread in New Hampshire. We never bought bread. And so then we had big steak fries, French fries, very, very good, and so forth. And so within 6 months, we'd both gained 30 pounds. And we're little people, I'm only 5'4", and my wife is only 5'2". And so, I looked like a Pillsbury Doughboy, for God's sake. So did she. So we became fat, and I said to myself, now I'm middle-aged and I have to be fat. I don't want to be fat. My wife came to the rescue. essentially. She got a job as the director of fine dining with a restaurant firm called Restaurant Associates in New York, and she was the director of an executive dining room for, I think it was Deutsche Bank at the time. And she'd gone up and left the house by 6 a.m. because they really served only breakfast and lunch in executive dining. And so the executives would come and they'd have breakfast and then they'd set up shop. And a lot of them would then come for lunch and they'd entertain their clients and so forth. And so there was this fellow. So the servers were coming into my wife's office early in the morning and saying, this Mr. So-and-so he has the same thing every day, which is bacon and eggs. And he's been losing weight steadily over the last several months. And it's very strange. So she decided to go talk to him. And it turns out he had a great story. This guy was really tall, 6'7". And he recently, and so he was, was a huge person. He'd recently undergone a second marriage to a young, good-looking 20-something. And she decided that he was eating all wrong and that he needed to, cut the fat and eat pasta primavera and basically a high carbohydrate diet. And he gained all kinds of weight within the first year of his new marriage, and to the point where he had to buy new clothes and everything. So he went to his doctor, and his doctor said, well, you need to go on Dr. Atkins' diet. So Dr. Atkins actually was a graduate of my medical, or where I was in New York City at Cornell Medical School. And he had published a book around 1980 called Dr. Atkins' Diet Revolution. I recommend that book if you want to read, if you really want to become educated about this. And what he tells you in this book is that if you cut your carbohydrate intake to less than 20 grams a day, and just to give you an idea, one of the things that's about this whole, the USDA has decided that they're going to label everything on the packages and the amount of this and the amount of that, but they give it in grams. Now, even though I'm a scientist and I deal with grams in the lab, I have no idea what a gram of sugar, how big that is, and so you don't know what you're doing, and nobody does. I don't know what I'm doing, but anyway, to give you a relative idea for that, the USDA nutrient recommendations, if you go online and you ask, so what am I supposed to eat? They'll say you should eat 300 grams of carbohydrates a day. I mean, this is huge. Yeah, so cutting down to 20, basically you just cut down to zero, as much as you possibly can. If you do that, then what happens is, and this came out later, I didn't understand exactly what Dr. Atkins, why he said what he said, because what he said was, as long as you cut out carbohydrates, you'll lose weight. You can eat as much fat as you want, you're still going to lose weight. And I didn't understand why that was. And it turns out that if you restrict the carbohydrate intake, then the body, because it doesn't have any carbohydrates to burn to make energy, it starts burning the fat. And that's good, because then you start mobilizing your belly and so forth. But in addition to that, what happens is that the body cannot break down the fat molecules as efficiently as it would if you had a lot of carbohydrates on board. And that's a little bit of a biochemical thing that I don't want to get into right now. But it burns fat 1/3 as efficiently as to make energy as it could. So that means you need to burn 3 times as many fat molecules to get the same amount of energy out of it. So not only do you mobilize your fat, now you're basically burning it up as fast as you can just to stay alive. So that's why you lose weight on the low carb diet. And now we have the keto diet and the paleo diet, and all of these diets are based on the idea that if you really restrict carbohydrates, you'll lose weight and you will be better off, essentially. So that's what my wife and I did back 20 years ago, and we lost 30 pounds in about another 6 months. And I've been on a low carbohydrate diet ever since. And it's really I've been on diets ever since when I was 13 years old. I rebelled against my mother, who was force feeding me, and I was a fat little kid. And I said, no more, I'm not gonna do that anymore, because I'd discovered girls, and I knew that I didn't want to be fat, because kids would tease me anyway. And so when I did that, I basically put myself on a calorie restricted situation where I drank a diet liquid twice a day, and that's all I had. I cut myself down to 500 calories a day. I lost all kinds of weight. Nobody recognized me at school the next year, and I got all kinds of girlfriends. So that was good. But the only thing wrong with calorie restriction is I was constantly, and I used calorie restriction until 20 years ago when I got onto the low carb diet. I was obsessed with food. I was always hungry, and all I thought about was food. With the low carb diet, it turns out, I was fine. I was never hungry, because the appetite centers in the brain, fat really satisfies those appetite centers. But if you cut down total nutrient intake so that you're calorie restricting, those receptors in the brain are crying out for food, and they're really crying out for carbohydrates. Because there's one other thing that I wanted to leave you with regard to the diet end of things, and that is, recently there's been a phenomenon that people have started to talk about called the 18-hour fast. And it turns out I've been on an 18-hour fast ever since I was 13, because what I did was I skipped breakfast, which was sold to us by the Kellogg manufacturers and Post and General Mills as being the most important meal of the day. Totally wrong. And so I cut out breakfast. And then what happens is, let's say you have dinner at 6 o'clock, and let's say you have a mixture of carbohydrates and fat and protein. What happens is that all those molecules go into the stomach and get absorbed into the bloodstream and get distributed in the body. And the body uses primarily the carbohydrates initially to just burn for energy, to keep our brains going and our heart beating and the whole thing. You don't even have to exercise strenuously. It takes a lot of energy to just keep the body going. So in order to be able to metabolize the carbohydrates, you need a molecule that's called insulin. Now, insulin is a small protein hormone molecule made by the pancreas that's necessary for the body to be able to absorb the glucose and fructose from the bloodstream into the cells. And if you don't have insulin, the glucose just builds up in the blood, essentially, and that's basically what diabetes is. So if you're a normal person, you eat a normal dinner at 6 o'clock, the blood glucose goes up, rises slowly, and then peaks, because the body starts to make insulin, and insulin causes the blood sugar to go into the cells, and so it comes down to baseline again. That whole process takes about 4 to 6 hours. So by midnight, your blood sugar has come down to the baseline level. Then the other thing that insulin does is that it causes, during that first 6 hours, between 6 p.m. and midnight, it causes the fat that you've ingested to be able to enter into the fat cells in your body. So the fat goes into the cells, and insulin makes it stay there. So long as insulin is up, the fat stays inside those cells. It's a storage kind of a situation. However, then at midnight, when the sugar levels come down, insulin levels come down, the body switches, and now it starts to mobilize that fat. And so all night long, you're using that fat so you can dream really well and so forth. And then by 6 a.m., when Kellogg's told us that we should be eating, sugar frosted flakes, if you don't eat breakfast between 6 a.m. and noon, you continue to mobilize your fat just in order to live. That's the 18-hour fast. And in terms, if you're really intent on losing weight, you do a low carb diet and you do an 18-hour fast, and I guarantee you will lose weight. Now, ultimately, you'll get to a point where you don't want to get too skinny. So then you can add a little bit of carbohydrate back again. You know, you can have that Snickers bar in the late afternoon, and so forth. And so now there's a very, very good website that's out there called dietdoctor.com, and I recommend it. It's a wonderful source of information, and I've gone through it for some of my friends before I recommended it to them, and it really has everything you really need. All the stuff I just told you is there. And now there's two other things that I think that it makes for a healthy lifestyle and prevents the accumulation of these so-called comorbidities over time as you age. The aging process is really, as far as I can tell, is very poorly understood by us scientists and physicians. But there are things that you can do to help your body go through the aging process and keep pretty much up to snuff. And one of them is exercise. I have to tell you the story when I in New York City at my gym in my apartment building. I would go down early in the morning, and there would be this other fellow down there who so I started to chat with him, and I became friends with him. And it turns out he was a federal judge in New York City. And he was a nice guy, and we started to chat about stuff, and he found out that I was a scientist and a doctor and so forth. And he said he was always on the treadmill every morning. And he was a slim guy. He wasn't overweight or anything, but he was doing the right thing. And he said, "So why am I doing this?" And I said, "I don't know. Why don't you tell me?" He said, "Well, I'm not going to get heart disease and cancer, right?" And I said, No. This is not going to help you prevent cancer and heart disease. Cancer, number one, is due to random mutations in cells that happens randomly, continuously, all throughout our lives. Heart disease, we still don't have a clue, as far as I can understand, about why the blood vessels. It's not the heart that is really gets diseased. It's the blood vessels that get diseased, and they clog up, and then you have a heart attack and so forth. And we don't understand that. And so what exercise can do for you is basically very simple. It just maintains your body's strength. When you get to be an old geezer and you're 80 plus, you can, if you start losing your balance, you can right yourself. You've got the strength so that you don't fall down and break your hip. Because once you fall down and break your hip, you're out of there essentially. And then the Grim Reaper starts knocking on your door. And so what you need to do is you just need to maintain your mobility. Your mobility is the most important thing that for your lifestyle, because as soon as you lose your mobility, then you become dependent rather than independent. You're on a walker, and then you're in a wheelchair, and that's not a good way to go. So you have to be optimistic and say to yourself, well, I'm going to live to be 90 or 100, and so I better take care of myself. And so then, therefore, what kind of exercise is important? And I'm a little bit biased because I'm very much more focused on maintaining muscle mass and strength rather than endurance and aerobic exercise. I'm just not a firm believer that aerobic exercise is going to help my heart. And so it depends on who you talk to, but this is what I've decided. And so, but your muscle mass and your strength is what's going to keep you from falling down and breaking your hip, and maintaining your mobility and your ability to get around and be independent. Now, there's one last thing that I think everybody should really learn about and find out about, and that's hormones. Hormone replacement therapy. If you're a female and you undergo menopause, I heartily recommend hormone replacement therapy with the sex hormones, estrogen on the one hand and progesterone on the other. It is a subject that has been controversial over the last 20, 30 years. But I think if you talk to your doctor, talk to your physicians, and also hormone replacement therapy, what it does for you, particularly estrogen and progesterone, are really important for bone strength and muscle mass and muscle strength. After the age of 50, let's say, if you're going to live to be 90, that's, the other half of your life. You need to have those hormones. Now, if you happen to be male, males don't undergo a drastic drop in their testosterone, their sex hormone, but their sex hormone is important for exactly the same things: bone strength and muscle strength. And so, what I did basically was to, when I got into my 60s, I decided that I better pay attention to this. And I researched it and so forth. And then I started, and so I got my blood levels of testosterone taken, and they were within the normal range. But the normal range in this instance is a very broad thing. But it's huge, and they say it's normal range for 20 to 40-year-olds. And so I said, okay, whatever. My levels were within the normal range, and so I did that every year, and I saw them gradually, progressively decrease over time. And finally, when they got to be lower than the lower limit of the normal range, I talked to my doctor, and then I started taking testosterone replacement therapy. And that has made a huge difference in my energy level. And in addition, my bone mineral density was getting sort of washed out, and it's come back again. So I heartily recommend it. The dangers of the hormone replacement therapy, whether you're female or male, are not huge. They're based on statistics and numbers of the percentages of people that get breast cancer and uterine cancer on the one hand, on the female end of things, and prostate cancer and heart disease on the male. But from the male standpoint, it's those two potential side effects are more fear than they are actuality, in terms of there aren't data to support the fear. That's where I'm coming from. So eat a healthy diet, stay away from sugar and starch, exercise, and get on hormones if you need. And I think that really is it in a nutshell, and you should be a happy camper. So I'll stop there.